This is the Coretex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. Episode 17. It's amazing how fast the time flies when you basically assign yourself a new research project every Thursday. Anyways, entering the off-season for hockey, other sports are kind of starting up too, like soccer in some areas, baseball. This is a concept that can cover both within season development as well as off-season development. I'm going to refer back to the long-term athletic development model. There was a time where I kind of viewed that as like an outdated model, but honestly, I didn't really go through it that closely. I didn't really understand it, but the more I go back and the more I read through it and familiarize myself with the actual model, again, the more I see that like it's close. I think it's actually quite close to what we should be optimizing for youth sports. In North America, recently, maybe in the last decade or so especially, youth sports are probably moving further and further away from this model. For example, for ages 12 to 18 years old, the LTAD model would suggest an 8 to 10 month participation. And in my view, I just look at that as there's inherently going to be some downtime. Like minimum, you're looking at 8 weeks of downtime, and that's accumulated throughout the year, of course. Furthermore, in the LTAD model is the trainability framework, and this is basically a map of how to apply the model. Within that, you've got the physical attributes like stamina, speed, strength, skill, and flexibility, but you can zoom out to different terms like adaptability and trainability. Adaptability and trainability are often used interchangeably, but there is a pretty key difference. That's adaptability is a change in the body as a result of something happening in the environment. So say you take a U13 AAA athlete and drop them into a U17 AAA practice. That's a huge difference for that athlete and their current ability. And for that athlete to have any kind of success, there's a morphological adaptation required to handle that added speed and strength and tempo and so on. That's probably just out of reach for a U13 AAA athlete. The thing is, not all athletes are equipped to handle an adaptation like this. And U13 to U17 is kind of a ridiculous jump, but this ability to cope, say if you had made a smaller jump from U13 to U15, is called trainability. And trainability is largely a function of the individual and their individual genetics specifically. As athletes operate in more challenging environments than what they're used to, some are just going to respond and adapt sooner than others. There's a parent side of me that thinks, hey, my kid has my genetics, so yeah, of course, I would hope they'd be one of the fast adapters, and that's also, of course, going to be a reflection of my own athletic ability in a way. But the coach side of me thinks, every parent thinks their kid is special and will be one of these fast adapters, which, as any other coach will attest, is not an uncommon conversation, and unfortunately one that's not entirely objective or even grounded in reality. At the time I record this, it's late March, so we've got some camp season underway, maybe some spring camps, and summer camps aren't too far away. And with the camps, there's going to be demands for kids to be placed in certain groups, and maybe it's going to be a good fit in the end, but also maybe it's not, and that perception is just a little bit skewed. The authors of this article address this idea of athletes playing up, but from the perspectives of coaches. The aim of this present study was to explore the experiences and decision-making processes of male football academy coaches working in the FDP from the UK. The FDP, I should say, is the UK equivalent of youth sports, and it just stands for Foundational Development Phase. The authors wanted to understand the decision making process of coaches as they rationalize players playing up in age group and how playing up can be better supported and implemented within an academy model. Now, I don't know about you that might be listening to this, but at first glance, it seems like playing up is viewed pretty positively and as usually a net beneficial practice for player development. The question is, how do they more organically build this idea of playing up into their academy or association frameworks? The title of this week's research is Coach Perceptions of Playing Up in Youth Football, and it was written by Adam L. Kelly and colleagues and published in the Journal of Sports Sciences just this month in 2026. Early on, the authors note the typical age-centered grouping of youth sports and note things like the relative age effect and relative growth effects. I've gone over the relative age effect a little while back in episode 1 about odds ratios, but it's essentially the bias toward first and second quarter born athletes relative to an age cutoff, suggesting that kids born earlier in a playing year have those extra months of growth and maturity compared to their peers born later on in the year. The relative growth effect is along a similar lens but different parameters. So instead of looking at where an athlete fits based on their age, it compares them based on their biological maturation. So the easy, low-hanging fruit here is to say that biological maturation is probably a better way to group youth athletes than chronological age. But part of me also kind of like shudders thinking about the logistics and outside influences and all the factors involved in organizing something like that. This idea of playing up actually goes by a couple of different names. For example, in some education frameworks like the International Baccalaureate, it's referred to as vertical integration, where a grade 7 student might be revisiting concepts from grade 6 as well as grade 8 in an effort to both leverage and compound previously learned skills as well as prepare for what's ahead. So, in addition to a long-term development feature, be it academic or athletic, playing up, it's often used as an attempt to work around these flaws of the age-related selection biases. This study was definitely a lot more subjective and perception based rather than a quantitative, outcome based meta analysis or discovery research that I've reviewed before. But I always believe in the value of popping up out of our own little ruts in the coaching world here to see what other coaches and even other sports are experiencing. The authors split this paper up into 3 prevailing themes that they noticed across the coaches, of which there were 10 coaches that agreed to take part in this interview style research. Also, just to note, this interview style research, the more qualitative type of research, as well as the relatively low number of coaches that were interviewed for this, is noted as a limitation later on in the back of the paper. I thought it was interesting and maybe revealing or compiling enough, at least to go over and make an episode of. So let's get into the first of the 3 themes. The first is that the language matters more than we might initially think. So things like deliberately not using the term playing up, but rather playing across. Especially when it comes time to return to their regular team, then coaches and parents can avoid using the term going back down and instead going back across. Call that what it is. I know the intentions are good, but part of me is just, maybe a little bit old school and like that. That's a little bit soft, but it is what it is. Another example of the communication is making sure that the players and the parents understand that playing up for some amount of time is not sending the message of, hey, you are the elite and the chosen one. but instead framing it as, well, you just need a different challenge right now. Within the communication lens is probably the most important question of just literally asking the player themselves if they even wanted to play up. I can personally think of and have seen quite a few, actually, reasons why a kid might just want to stay with their current group rather than going up to the next age group. Either way, the coaches who were interviewed made the point of telling the athlete and their family that moving up and down is just a normal part of the year. If a kid thinks that getting sent back down is equivalent to failure of some sort, then the system itself is already being abused or mishandled. Now, I'm not entirely sure about the demographic of listeners to this show in terms of parents or coaches or athletes, but for the coaches listening, here's a little bit of catharsis. The participants in the study note that parents didn't really understand the process of playing up. They repeatedly report that parents overestimate what playing up actually means, that they typically see it as a signal to a professional pathway rather than a temporary developmental intervention. Maybe a brief conflation of outcome for process in this case. The second theme that came up was about social environment for the athletes driving the development. This is probably the first thing that I would have cited as to why I would encourage athletes to play up if the opportunity presents itself. But even then, it's not a hard rule. I've seen strong U15 teams with a great team culture and weak U18 teams with a terrible team culture and terrible practice habits, which would be a case that I would argue where playing up isn't going to have the same desired effect. Participants note that parents are a super strong driver with the social environment aspect where they typically go down one of two paths, either one of support or sabotage. Supportive parents make the athlete feel comfortable in a new and challenging situation where the sabotaging parents will push either way too hard or just misread the signals as to what playing up means and why it's happening in the first place. To put it bluntly, parents can either stabilize this potentially disruptive experience or just completely and outright distort it and what it actually means and what's actually happening. Now, this next point struck me as sort of in a perfect world scenario, but participants noted the decision making of who to bring up is more than just a coach's gut feel at the time. Participants said that ideally, they would include the assistant coaches at both teams, the current team as well as the team that the player is going to go up to, and include any strength and conditioning coaches that are available to gauge physical strength in the bigger and heavier environment, and not just the required skill. The paper also suggests physios and analysts. Now, I'm not sure exactly how youth sport operates in the UK, but for most of the youth sport over here in North America, I'm honestly not even sure what an analyst would be. I'd also offer my own criticism in that, yes, it's good to do some homework and have a professional assessment, but at some point, you just have to make a decision without performing this extensive background check on whether to call a player up to a practice or a game or not. Then there's the socialization from the actual player's point of view. The player, keep in mind, is leaving a familiar team with familiar peers and friends, as well as a defined role, and being dropped into this brand new hierarchy that might be completely unfamiliar. No doubt that you can expect at least some social anxiety, maybe reduced confidence or some withdrawal as they figure out their place, but this is also highly individual and definitely not a consistent rule. Finally, the third section here, these are the intended developmental effects as well as some of the risks. Here's the reason I like playing up if it's a good match quality. Practices at any given level have a performance ceiling. A team can go as fast as they can go and be as intense as they can be before hitting a ceiling of some sort. Keeping in mind that an intense practice without the execution to match probably just isn't really achieving much. Playing up in an environment that's just faster, heavier, stronger, less space, quicker decisions, smarter plays, different reads, and different tactics, those things all force someone to be really good and even operate on the edge or slightly outside their current ability just to keep up. No player wants to be a drill killer, so you're going to match that pace that's around you. This optimal point is a similar idea to another learning theory called the zone of proximal development. And this is a Lev Vygotsky theory that I've referred to in some previous videos. But this research calls it challenge point theory. Simply, optimal learning happens when challenge slightly exceeds current ability. If the environment is too easy, well, no growth, stagnation. What if the environment's just too hard? Well, then you'll see things like frustration and probably a lot of failure. Less involvement, fewer touches. If the athlete isn't involved, then development just stalls. This, I suppose, is where the question of is it better to make AAA and hardly play, or to play AA and get the meaningful minutes? I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer to that, but in my experience, ego tends to have more of a voice than it should. And maybe it's a combination of both, where most minutes are played at AA with some playing up at AAA. But like I said, every situation is different there. Participants in this report came to sort of a crossroads with the psychosocial effects, noting about as many positives as negatives when it came to playing up. That maybe sounds a little bit more misleading than it actually is, because a lot of the positives also appear on the negatives list, but I'll explain what that means in a second here. With the positives that were noted, I'll even add in that these have to be handled properly and turned into learning experiences, because they note things like resilience and humility and exposure to failure, which implies that an athlete who was once this big fish in the small pond is now just having their identity challenged. They're not the big fish anymore. They're not the key role player anymore. But humility can be a really good thing, especially if it's met with good communication and good support as the athlete enters this new adaptation phase. However, if handled poorly, the participants noted things like confidence drops with that identity disruption and some new mannerisms, like athletes displaying this I'm not good enough type thinking. Players might start to internalize the failure if overwhelmed and unsupported. Not to mention, there's probably going to be a physical risk of a younger, maybe smaller player going up to play against the bigger and faster players. Again, it's tough to justify development if the kid isn't actually physically safe in the environment. So, where do we end with all this? Playing up is very much context dependent, individual dependent, and environment dependent. It's far from a one-size-fits-all development solution, and for some players in some years, it might just be a bad idea. My whole intent with playing up or vertically integrating our players was to optimize the development, but I learned that it might perhaps be an unintended way of redistributing opportunity to players who just mature at different rates, especially once the selection window is closed. Likewise, maybe another way to provide more development opportunity to early maturing or advanced players by continuing to challenge them with just a faster paced, more difficult environment. That does it for this week's episode. A little bit shorter, a little bit sweeter than previous weeks. New episodes will be available every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube at the channel Coretex Goaltender Development. If you would like to help support the show, which is currently a one-man operation, you can head over to patreon.com/CoretexAthleticReview. Once again, thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful. My name's Evan Carrillo. This is the Coretex Athletic Review. Stay out of your own way.